The Federal Reserve has a reputation for being bad, but what was banking like before the Federal Reserve? Follow me down the rabbit hole to find out. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm your host, Danny, and today we are talking about banking before the Federal Reserve, which I feel like gets overlooked a lot. So, before the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the United States experienced a varied and often chaotic banking system, particularly during the 19th century. So, the early US banking system between like the 1790s and the 1830s was kind of federally backed because they had an established centralized banking system with the creation of the first Bank of the United States in 1791. This was established under the Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. However, the charter for the bank expired in 1811, and the country returned to a decentralized system. The country's banking system during this time was a mix of state chartered banks and private institutions with very little federal oversight. Each state had the authority to charter its own banks, and banks issued their own banknotes, which were not universally accepted and were often worth way less than their face value. So then in the 1830s, we have this introduction of what's called wildcat banking. So this happened between the 1830s and the 1860s. The term wildcat banking is used to describe the chaotic and often fraudulent banking practices that emerged during this time, especially in the frontier regions. Wildcat banks were typically small state chartered institutes with little to no capital reserves. So they would issue banknotes that were often backed by nothing. And then these banks were often they would operate in isolated areas far from any established financial centers, which made it difficult for people to redeem their banknotes for silver or gold. The term wildcat actually refers to the notion that these banks were as unpredictable and as unreliable as wildcats on the frontier. These banks would often spring up quickly. They would make a bunch of loans, issue paper money. They would do all these things. And then when people attempted to get their money back or redeem their notes, they would find that the banks had collapsed or just completely disappeared, taking all their savings with them. And actually, I think that this is where people were not trusting banks during this time, because you put your money in a bank, you're not necessarily going to get your money back. There were a couple of causes of wildcat banking. So after the demise of the Second Bank of the United States, which happened in 1836, states were responsible for chartering banks. This led to inconsistent regulations and oversight, and this meant that there was no centralized regulations or insurance system, so individual states had varying standards for bank reserves and note issuance. However, the U.S. was expanding westward, so people needed loans and they needed easy credit so that way they could procure land, they could start their homestead or whatever they were going to do heading west. So this wildcat banking was actually really prominent in the Midwest and the frontier areas. That doesn't mean that it wasn't happening on the eastern seaboard, the east side of the U.S., but it was really happening in the frontier. This actually all led to the Panic of 1837. So the problems with wildcat banking really came to a head then. A financial crisis triggered by speculative lending and the collapse of the land bubble, which was partly funded by these unregulated banks. So this panic began in the spring of 1837. It lasted until the mid 1840s. The panic led to bank failures, widespread unemployment, and a severe economic depression. This event highlighted the dangers of an unstable banking system and underscored the need for regulation. After the Panic of 1837, many states enacted laws to try to rein in wildcat banking, but the practice persisted in some regions. The federal government took some steps to regulate the banking system, including President Andrew Jackson's Specie Circular of 1836, which required land purchases to be made in gold and silver rather than paper money. The National Banking Act of 1863, also an amendment in 64, was in response to the banking instability and the need to fund the Civil War. Of course, wars bring us out of depressions. We see that with World War II, right? So they're like, well, we need some sort of national banking act because the Civil War was looming. These laws established a system of national banks, which were federally chartered and were required to hold reserves in gold or silver. This system aimed to create a more uniform currency and reduce the proliferation of wildcat banks. The National Banking Act did not fully eliminate the problem of bank instability, but it significantly improved the situation by creating a system of federally regulated banks that could issue national banknotes backed by government bonds. And this all leads us into our special guest. If you haven't noticed yet, we have Jeremy Corden here to explain a little bit more about wildcat banking, about banks before the Federal Reserve, and why. And we're gonna get into like a whole episode about like the Federal Reserve and why it's bad. But let's get into why maybe we needed the Federal Reserve when we got it. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This really is an interesting topic, and like a lot of topics I'm sure you cover, it's a bit of a rabbit hole
It
where you
is.
can go down and you can learn more and more and more because on the surface, if you go to school, if you watch videos on the internet, just about anyone will tell you that the kind of free banking period was chaotic and didn't work for a lot of people, and there were a lot of problems. And, you could argue that there's a lot of problems with the current system too. So,
Absolutely.
so really what you have is trade-offs, right? During that period, you had some banks that would, they'd go bankrupt, they'd lose everybody, everything. But under a similar system in Canada for about, I want to say about 100 years, you didn't have a lot of those problems. I mean, if you were to go back in time, what those people would tell you is that the banks were forced to lend to the government. Um, and oftentimes these government projects would go insolvent and it would wipe out creditors.
Wow.
Now, the other thing is like banking regulations would keep money only circulating in localized areas. So if you had a state bank, some state governments would make it so your notes could only circulate locally. So if you left that area, you couldn't use your money anymore, or you could use it at a discount.
Well, I was
Now,
going to ask about that. So uh, people weren't really traveling as much as they're traveling now, though, unless they were like moving, like actively moving westward. But a lot of people were staying pretty local, right? Like, would that really affect people that much in the time?
well, you look at like the 1880s and the 1890s, and railways connected the whole country.
That's true. Yeah.
So people were moving around. I mean, that's when they had to start rolling out time zones, is because they invented railroads, and for the first time, you could tell
Yeah.
because you could travel a lot faster. But no, I wouldn't say it affected the average person. Um, what people started doing, what the banks started doing, is they made deals with other banks that, hey, we'll redeem your dollars for face value. You redeem our dollars for face value. And it wasn't really any different, having if you had a note that was a $5 bill from the State Bank of New York, it wasn't really different to the end user than having something from the State Bank of Florida because of these agreements. It wasn't any different than, having a different name of a bank on a check that you would receive, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah.
So you started seeing a lot more of that interchangeability. What I think forced the issue for central banking um, was really the government wanted to be able to borrow a lot more money. And rather than borrowing it from a lot of little small players, they wanted to have kind of one place to go.
That makes sense.
So it's very much for the convenience of the government. I don't know
Of
if that's
course.
the convenience of everybody. Um, I mean, now it's like when I was going to high school, what I was told, and this is 10 years ago. No, not 10 years, but a long time ago. It's longer every time I talk about it. Uh, when I went to high school a long time ago, um, my history teacher basically said that the main reason we went to World War I was because of how the loans were done in Europe. Did you hear this too?
No, so it was like the assassination of the Arch
Well, that's
Ferdinand,
why Europe
whoever.
went to war.
Right, but I
So
never
why would
knew.
America go to war over the assassination of some guy?
Right, but I guess I didn't really pay attention in history. Like I never really knew why. But I guess like we were allies, so that's why we went to war. I haven't done a lot
Okay.
of research into World War One. I've done a lot of research into World War Two, though.
Okay. So, well, they'll say it's the sinking of Lusitania.
Right.
And the Germans will say, "Hey, you violated." They said, "Hey, you violated international treaties. You were shipping weapons to countries at a time of war. So your cruise liner became a war target. Lusitania was a big
Which
cruise.
makes no sense. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you're shipping weapons, then you're a target." And the United States said, "No, we weren't shipping weapons. You guys are the Huns. You're barbarians. You just like killing people because you're so filled with bloodlust that you just couldn't help yourselves but to kill all these Americans." Which is,
Typical American government gaslighting.
well, it sounds like war propaganda. It sounds like
Yeah.
terrible war propaganda. But at the time, people ate it up, and some people didn't. They wanted us to stay out of the war. We didn't need to get involved in a European war. Um, but this was in 1914. It was a year after the Federal Reserve was established.
So now we have a bank to make loans.
Now we have a mega bank to make mega loans.
Right.
But you still have, all these other banks too. And what the data will show you is that 98 or 99% of the loans are going to the Allies who are losing the war. So you
Right.
have the sinking of the Lusitania, and I don't think that was in 1914. I think we came into the war a little later. It
I
was
think
the
we did. Yeah.
16 or 1917. So you have the sinking of this cruise liner, and
But there's
that
no way
was.
we weren't issuing loans before that, and we weren't in the war before that.
Oh no, we
Just
were
like with World War II, like we were
very.
in that war before we were in the war.
And I very much use the royal we because the average American wasn't in the war. The
Right.
average American was minding their own business, right? But the big players, the new central bank, the lenders, the political class, they're very committed to, um, oh gosh, was it the Allies? No, that was World War II. Who was fighting the Germans?
I don't know. Let me Google it. I got my computer right here, right?
I wouldn't be surprised if they called them the Allies the whole time, but it
Right.
was France, it was Britain.
In World War One.
I
Here
want
we
to say
go.
Italy was one
Yeah,
of
the
those
Allied powers. Here we go. France,
Allied
Great
powers.
Britain,
Yep.
Russia, Italy, Japan, and then later the United States.
Okay, so
Fighting
you
the Central Powers. Yeah.
you have the Allied powers fighting the Central powers, and if you look at the data, all the loans are going to the Allied powers. And the argument that was made was, hey, if the Allied powers don't win this war, Americans are going to lose all their savings because they've basically bet on the wrong horse.
Yeah.
And we can't afford to bet on the wrong horse. So, we have to go in there and protect ourselves, right?
So do you think that they orchestrated the sinking of the Lusitania in order to get us into the war so that way we can make sure that we didn't lose this fight?
No,
Okay.
I don't think that. Because what the Germans said, the reasons why the Germans said they sank it is because there were weapons on the ship. And, for 100 years or 80 years, the government, has denied this. But then this is not that long ago. They sent submarines down. They found the Lusitania.
Hmm.
I think it was off the coast of Ireland or somewhere. And lo and behold, they're pulling out heavy weaponry and ammunition and shells and all these things out of the bottom of the ship.
So like maybe the Germans intercepted some communication between like us and I don't know, whoever overseas and they're like, "Oh, there's for sure weapons on here." So they sank the ship.
They sank the ship. They sank the ship because the German intelligence said that there were weapons, and there were, and the Americans said, "Nah, you're lying." But, if you need to get public support for going to war with Germany, thousands of Americans dying, it was a great tragedy to do that. And this is, keep in mind,
Similar to Pearl Harbor.
this is over 100 years ago. And in studying history, what's so fascinating, for me about studying history is human nature doesn't really change.
Correct. Yeah.
People lie, people connive, people, push out propaganda. Um, it's not, and the people that deride conspiracy theorists today, it's like, okay, so to not be a conspiracy theorist, which is a term that was made up by the CIA in like what, the 60s to
Yeah, it was about JFK's assassination. They're
slander
like, oh,
people that had
if
a,
you
yeah,
don't believe this, then you're a conspiracy theorist. Yeah.
yeah. No, I mean, the history is full of nothing but conspiracies that were either successfully or unsuccessfully pulled off. And they're so effective because they work. The average person wants to trust in authority figures. They want to trust in the government. They want to trust that, their interest is, you know, um, being protected. And when that's not the case, the idea of feeling alone that way and kind of confronting, um, these powerful forces that don't have your best interests is so intimidating. I think it's just better to kind of retreat and say, oh, no, 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 that can't be true. That can't be right. The
It's
government
easy.
would never do that. That company would never do that. They would never, subvert my liberty. They would never, try to take my money. They would never try to take my power. No one would ever try to take my power. And it's like, that's a very naive way of living. I mean, that is your head is in the sand. But here we go. We're in World War II. The Lusitania's been sunk. There's a lot of finger pointing. Americans are lying. We know that they were lying. And here we go to World War I. And it's so bad now that it's taught that this was really over loans. It's like we went to World War I to back up our loans. So you had hundreds of thousands of young American men dying in Europe to protect the new central bank.
Over a war that was not ours.
It wasn't our war. It was the central bank's war. And that's why they say that every war, every modern war is a central banking war. Because who can finance the government to the point where they can do a war? War is expensive.
War's expensive.
It's central banks. Central banks finance wars. And if you look at the Civil War, which was, the most expensive war in American history before World War I and before World War II, how did they finance it? Do you know?
Well, so in my research, I found like the National Banking Act, but that had to be like just a like kind of like this the Federal Reserve before the Federal Reserve, right? So I guess I don't really know.
Well, I mean, the central banking isn't a new idea. Even in 1913, Jackson got rid of the central bank. He got rid of the national bank. And Andrew Jackson insisted that only gold and silver coins should really be used. And then that became, okay, well, private banks can make credit, they can make banknotes, they can have a fractional reserve system with coins, but the government can't do that. And if you're going to lend to the government, you have to lend them gold coins. And what that was a higher bar for the government to borrow money than everybody else. And the thought was, I think the sentiment was the government shouldn't be borrowing money anyway. So the bar should be higher for the government to borrow money. And that kind of worked. It kind of worked until the government got an appetite for wanting to spend a lot of money. So during the Civil War, um, Abraham Lincoln was in a tough spot because he couldn't really borrow money. There wasn't a great infrastructure for the government, for the federal government, just borrowing unlimited amounts of money. But he had this war he wanted to fight against the southern states.
Hmm.
What they did is they abandoned the gold standard during the Civil War and they mass printed greenbacks.
Hmm.
And it devalued the currency. We saw the worst inflation in American history during the Civil War. And that was their plan to, more or less finance the Civil War.
So was the South doing the same thing or like something similar to that?
I suspect they were because I think they were hit with pretty hard inflation too.
Right.
I don't think they were financing it with specie. I don't think that they were using hard money to finance their war.
Because there's like two sides to this battle and like yeah, like one side is the winner, one side's the loser, but like they're both doing something to get money. So are they doing the same thing?
I think they were. And you made the comment earlier that, war will get you out of depression. And I think they teach that a lot, but you could argue that I don't know if that's really true because it's like you see a lot of economic activity during a war and you
Hmm.
get a lot of fewer unemployed people during a war, which is, you could argue that's the end of the depression. But if you're defining a depression as a period of reduced economic activity, um, a war is not productive economic activity. If you take all of these working age men right out of the economy so they can sit around, bases and get shipped around and do training, what they're not doing is they're not manufacturing, they're not farming, they're not
Which we
producing.
saw during World War II. I don't know about again, I haven't done that much research into World War One,
Well,
but
well, well, during World War II, we had rations.
yeah.
When in American history have we had rations? It's like, does that not sound like a depression to you?
No, it sounds like a depression. Like the
Sounds
whole
like a
thing,
depression.
yeah.
Yeah, you have rationed goods because again, a lot of your workforce isn't working. It's fighting.
The females, they weren't working. Like that wasn't a time when like women were working and they couldn't go to war either. I mean, you do see some war like women doing certain things like in the Navy. They had the Waves program, but like different things, right? But typically, like, yeah, you just took the entire workforce away to go fight a war that wasn't ours yet again.
Well, you took a lot of the workforce. I mean, there's older men, that are working. You have a lot of more kids and child labor during World War II. You have women entering the workforce to try to, make ends meet and kind of keep things together. Um, but, during the highest times of economic prosperity in American history, you didn't have women working as much. Like you didn't really need to. I mean, if you look at the 60s, and we're jumping around topics now,
Of course.
the equivalent. Every time I look at this, like I think the baby boomers got a better deal. Minimum wage in the 1960s would be equivalent to about $100 an hour today.
Wow.
So like you could just, go out, you could get a mortgage for your home by signing your name and um, you could easily support a family on one income. And, tell me that's not wealth to only need one income.
Well, and they had like a decent life. Like it wasn't like you're
Sure.
struggling with two incomes trying to like barely make ends meet and like feed your family, right? Whereas like then you had one income, you could buy a house, you had decent cars, like you had a decent life, you were going to the beach on a vacation, like
There
all
were
these
things to do.
things. Yeah.
People had money and money left over for building the American middle class and buying all the new appliances and inventions and things. And it was really a golden age. Um, but we weren't there until after we got back our fighting men from World War II. I'd argue that the depression that started in the 1930s um, didn't really end until after Roosevelt died. It didn't really end
Wow.
until after World War II. It might
So
have not even ended until after the Korean War fully.
what would you say led to the depression in the 1930s? Because there's what we learned, right? But what is there any underlying like thing that we don't know that led to that depression, or was it just like the crash of the stock market?
You know, I think that there were a myriad of factors that fed into the Great Depression.
Okay.
Uh, part of it was the Dust Bowl, part of it was overinvestment. Um, I mean, you have the whole Midwest, getting torn up with, dust storms and destroying crops and, ruining loans. I think so. I think there's a lot of things. I don't know enough about the topic to really speak to it.
Okay.
Um, but kind of going back to this, free banking period, I think there's an argument to be made that for the average person, it might not be as bad as they claim to have a lot of smaller actors in a private free market space doing money and doing banking versus one big central bank. Because if you have one big central bank and that bank makes a mistake, let's say that mistake is lending trillions of dollars to the allied powers that are going to lose a war, like, hey, you know what? Maybe you had to do World War I. Maybe you had to send all of our men out to, die in Germany to defend those loans because we would have been economically bankrupt as a country had we not done that. But if we didn't have a central bank at the time, and American interests had, or American banks had lent to both sides equally, or better yet, didn't lend to parties that were at war because there's a 50% chance you don't get that loan back because someone's going to lose
Right.
that. If that was just not the practice to do, then hundreds of thousands of Americans didn't have to die.
Well, the timing is also like interesting to me that the Federal Reserve came around in 1913 and then World War One started in 1914.
I mean, that might have been a coincidence. Um, it might have been. America didn't enter for, 3, 4 years later.
Right, but if we're backing the Allied powers during that war with our centralized bank, but
Maybe, yeah, you might be right. Maybe the Allied powers were so confident to get to war because the central bank was established and they figured they could get unlimited money to finance a war.
yeah, I've got some more questions about
Yeah,
that.
we got more digging to do. I mean, it's so
Absolutely.
fascinating. It is like there's just so many layers that are there.
Right.
And I think the question is, people ask, it's like, well, you know, um, yeah, they want to audit Fort Knox. And, there's this kind of political push, Trump wants to, set up like a like a sovereign wealth fund for the United States. They want to have a crypto depository for the United States. It sounds like he's looking at other options outside of just central banks.
Hmm.
And, central banks are just so entrenched now where, I mean, maybe that will happen, maybe it won't. Um, but I think it's got people wondering, well, what does a post-central bank world look like? Or what could it even look like? What's the alternative to the Federal Reserve? If the Federal Reserve were to shutter tomorrow, who's issuing money? What does the money look like? And, can that kind of system work? And it worked really well in Canada. It worked really well in Scotland, where you have banks and they have gold on deposit and they, issue notes. And really, it just comes down to the credibility of individual actors, right? Because it's a free
Yeah.
market. People can pick where they put their money. And, now with cryptocurrency, with increased transparency, um, I think we're already seeing a lot more activity in the private sector of alternatives to money being offered. I think that people in the crypto space would argue that's what cryptocurrency is. It's like, hey, the central bank just makes money out of thin air and a very low accountability system. And maybe cryptocurrency is just money out of thin air, but at least it's a more accountable, transparent system where it's not money out of thin air to lend to a government that's also unaccountable and also spending your money by the trillions on, wars.
Well,
Like,
actually, it made me question, like, I don't know. I'm kind of going back and forth. So, like with cryptocurrency, there's like a lot of different options. Yes, Bitcoin is like the most valuable cryptocurrency that we're seeing right now. That doesn't mean that other crypto can't get there. I don't know a lot about cryptocurrency. I'm not going to speak to that very much. But the Federal Reserve, isn't that a monopoly then? And like, how many monopolies have we seen the US government break up because one company can't hold all the power of one thing? Well, if the Federal Reserve basically holds all the power of our money, isn't that a monopoly?
you'd think so. And it's a private company.
Right. So how is that not like
Well, the
breaking
Federal Reserve,
antitrust
but really
laws?
it's a private company because they have a special charter. It's
So
a special government sanctioned monopoly.
yeah. But oh, so that because it's government sanctioned, that's the only one that we're like, yep, we're good with that monopoly, but everybody else, I don't know. I think that I guess I have more questions about like the National Banking Act and like the way like that happened before the Federal Reserve. Was that a good system outside of wildcat banking, which we obviously know was kind of
Yeah, there were some sketchy banks,
wild?
things that failed, and there were some fraudsters out there. Definitely. But you also, it worked for most people most of the time.
Okay.
And if it didn't work, the banks would, go out of business and they knew it. And, a lot of the problems I think that could be attributed to, the period of free banking was actually just state regulations um, impacting these banks where they were forced to loan to the government, um, and create these bonds for the government that would immediately lose value and it would make the banks insolvent. And you didn't see that in Canada and you didn't see it in Scotland. So it's not that free banking can't work.
Right.
We know it can work, but I don't think big government likes the free banking system because
They can't
the
get all the
governments
money from
they
one
can't
place.
borrow all the money they want. And
Well,
and that limits the power and scope of the government in a way that is unacceptable to people that don't feel like it should be limited.
but then also like having independent banks instead of the federal bank, like that could, especially in today's day and age with like I don't know. I think that there's still going to be some sketchy things about it. I don't think it's like a perfect banking system. Don't get me wrong. But then people have the power to vote with their money the way that we've always been able to do. Like you don't like this company or this bank, you wouldn't put your bank there or your money there in that
Sure.
bank. So
Yeah,
then that bank would go out of business because now you know like this is a good bank. We everybody puts their money there. This is a bad bank. That bank's gone. Well, now you have like more power to actually vote with your money versus now you're like, "Oh, I don't like Chase. I prefer Wells Fargo, whatever."
hey, if
Right?
you
Doesn't
don't like the
matter.
Federal Reserve, if you don't like central banks, you're still going to use their products.
Exactly. Like you don't
Because
have any power. They've taken it
and,
away.
and how many other private companies are like that?
Oh, so many.
Like, hey, if you don't like Tesla, don't buy their car.
Yeah,
Don't be on X if you don't like Elon Musk. Like you
exactly.
can boycott, I mean, the power comes from you, right?
I mean, and in some cases it's more challenging, right? Like you think about like the healthcare world, right? And it
Sure.
makes it more challenging, but we're gonna have that same discussion where it's like the government oversight versus or like big pharma oversight versus like little guys. It's really
Well, I
hard
mean,
to vote
you
with
go
your
to the
money there
hospital
too.
and you don't know what a procedure costs. And
Yeah.
it's by design. And you talk to them and you get them to explain themselves, and they'll say crazy things like, well, the reason why we don't post our prices and the reason why we have these prices, the reason why it's $10,000 to visit your doctor is imagine you were a sheik from the Middle East and you had to see a doctor in America. Well, we wouldn't want to like not charge him $10,000.
Yeah.
And it's like, it sounds really dishonest.
Yeah.
Sounds like if you ran a restaurant, you'd have a separate menu for someone you thought was rich and a menu for everybody else.
Exactly.
Usually we just call that dishonest.
And most people would not go to that restaurant.
Right. But if every restaurant's doing that, you know what I mean? It's like I think the healthcare industry as a whole is just super corrupt. I lived in Mexico and I could see a doctor for 15 bucks. And they took walk-ins. $15 and you could have a full-on doctor's appointment. There's no insurance or anything, just 15 bucks. You could see a doctor.
Yeah, I think anything that the government starts to put their fingers in, it gets a little dicey, gets a little weird. That I think that's why
Well,
people point to the Federal Reserve and they're like, "Well, I don't have any power against them."
here's the thing. People point at the government and they blame all these problems on the government. But I think you'd be surprised to know how many healthcare companies and how many hospitals and how many um, arms manufacturing companies lobby the government,
Oh
put
yeah,
their people in government, and ensure that their special interest is always protected and that they're always blessed and there's kickbacks and everything else.
oh yeah,
And I think that as we're reconciling with that today, hey, what kind of government culture do you want? I mean, if it's just kickback culture and everyone's special interest is getting met, right now it's bankrupting the nation.
and
You
we're
know,
seeing that.
well, we're 30 plus trillion dollars in debt, and it's ruining things. Um, you know, and speaking of alternatives, um, there are alternatives to central banking. They're not super common and they're not super widespread, but I've got one here. Check this out. So all the money used to be made out of gold. This
Hmm.
is a money system that is made out of gold
Okay,
and it keeps all of its value. We designed it to resist inflation.
Let's talk about these gold backs. I'm very curious about this. I want to talk more about this.
Okay.
So,
So,
no, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna let you just take it away. So I want to know about it. Why you're not the first person to do it, right? But you have this whole company. You're the founder. You're the CEO, and I want to know everything about it.
Okay. So, this is 1/1000th of an ounce of gold, and
Okay.
it was designed to be inflation-proof currency. And this is a form of gold that has never been counterfeited. It's very counterfeit resistant. Um, and when these came out, they were worth about $2, and that was 5 years ago. Care to guess what they're worth today?
Probably more than that, I would say.
About $6.
Okay.
So the value is going up. It's part of an interchangeable system. Here's a five. So the five has 5 times as much gold as the one. It costs 5 times as much. So there's gold actually in these things. And people are spending these and they're using them as money locally.
And people are accepting them.
Yes.
Hmm. I like that
So
because it's
we,
kind of it's like people forcing people to go back to the gold standard, kind of.
no, nobody's forcing anybody. So the gold back started as a local currency. It's a state by state project. It's based off state laws that allow it to exist,
Okay.
basically. And we started in Utah. And now we've got 10 businesses that take Goldbacks as payment for every one small business that takes payment in cryptocurrency
Oh, I like that.
because it's easy to use. You could
Yeah.
just you
It's
go
like
in,
cash. You can literally just hand it to them.
cash. It's just, you pay it and it's done. There's no 40-digit password. There's no 40-digit wallet ID. There's no, hey, download this app on your smartphone.
Right.
And, we're gonna, transfer some Bitcoin here. This is as fast as cash. And it's
Yeah.
a fungible, interchangeable system. So we're building up that network and we just started launching more and more states. So we started in Utah, then we went to Nevada, then New Hampshire, then Wyoming and South Dakota. So kind of smaller states where we could
Hmm.
get business owners really excited. But our latest project is Florida.
I saw that the Florida, yeah, and the five.
Yep. So we're getting more business owners in Florida that are signing up to take these as payment. And I suspect that will, end up with thousands upon thousands. But again, we're finding that about half of small business owners are willing to take payment in gold. Because
Well, why wouldn't you?
why wouldn't you?
Exactly. Like that doesn't it do, there's no downside to taking payment in gold,
And the alternative is to take payment in cash.
we're seeing is not a great alternative
Well, it's losing value.
every single day.
Now, it costs money to do this. It costs money to split an ounce of gold into 1,000 pieces.
Right.
These aren't sold at spot. These aren't sold at the melt price of gold because they couldn't be, otherwise they wouldn't be able to exist.
Hmm.
And I get a little bit of criticism for that. And, oh, why are you charging, double spot for these? It's like, well, for one, you're not going to find a cheaper gold product that's this fractional. Um, but even if you did, people are using these instead of dollars. And what's the floor on the dollar? What's the lowest the value of a dollar could be?
$1, right?
Oh, it's just, well, I guess if you measure it in dollars, but what's the how little value can a dollar have?
Zero.
Right. There's no floor.
Yeah, you could just
Go
go to
all the
zero.
way down to the bottom, and it happens to fiat currencies all the time. Um, what about Bitcoin? What's the floor on the Bitcoin? How low can the value of a Bitcoin go?
I mean, we've seen that too. I mean, it's zero, right? It can also go all the way down to zero.
Go all the way down to zero.
It's
So yeah, you're right. At every
yeah.
cryptocurrency, the floor is, basically zero,
Hmm.
unless it's like a asset-backed stable thing, right? Um, the gold back, the worst thing that could ever happen to you is you'd have to melt them down, which, no one's had to do. There's a very strong market for these, in which case your floor is the melt value of the gold itself, which is, about 50%. That's
Which
way
is
better than the
way
dollar.
better than $1. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing with the gold back. We're building up networks. We're going to be launching in more states. I'd love to eventually have a gold back in most, if not all of the states in the United States.
Do,
So this year we're going to launch probably more states.
okay.
Uh, and then, next year we could be doing 3 or 4 more states.
Do you have some certain states like in mind that you want to launch in this year?
Oh,
Can you
absolutely.
share that?
No, they haven't been
Okay.
announced.
Okay.
Haven't been announced yet. Where do you think we should launch? Where do you think we should push gold backs?
I don't know. I think that everywhere. I think the whole US, right? But I think that you're gonna be more successful right off the bat with I'm glad that you got Florida. I'm sure like you're probably working on Texas. Like some of these more like I don't know, like bigger like states that are bigger but almost more conservative. And I hate to say that, but I think that people get scared with change. I don't know why you'd be scared with goldbacks. I think that that makes a lot of sense, but I would say probably Texas would be a good spot for you to push.
Well, here's what's fascinating about the gold back. It's a local currency, but it's also gold. And historically, gold, at least last 30 years or 40 years, has been more associated with the political right.
Hmm.
But local currencies have been more associated with the political left.
Hmm. So you'd
And you
think
think,
that anybody would be excited about. I don't know why anybody would not be excited about this. I
well,
don't know, like it
it
doesn't seem to be
attracts
political to me at all.
it
Like
attracts a lot of people, and money's for everybody. So I
everybody,
mean, one of
yeah.
our most successful states has been New Hampshire, which isn't really a conservative state.
Right.
I mean, maybe it's libertarian. There's a lot of libertarians in New Hampshire. Um, but there's also like a lot of left-leaning libertarians. This is kind of your Occupy Wall Street crowd.
Okay.
Through the big corporations, we don't trust them. Like, okay, what's the biggest corporation? That's a monopoly. Is it the one that makes all of the money that everybody uses?
Yep.
You
That's the
trust those
one.
guys? Do you want to boycott them? Because you don't have to use their product. You could use something else. Or you could use their product and complain about it, whatever. I mean,
Which
that's
everybody does, right? And I
everybody
mean,
does.
that's common in every realm, right? People are like, I hate Amazon, and they go on Amazon and buy something, right? So it happens everywhere.
Right.
But if you can do something about it, again, vote with your money. Like do
Right.
something about it.
Do something about it. And that's what we see. We have a calculator. I don't know how many people use gold backs, but I get some hints because once it's out there, it's private by nature. It's just like cash.
Yeah.
We've got a calculator on goldback.com, and I can see how many people are using this calculator. So in 2023, the calculator was used over 60,000 times,
That's
which
pretty
isn't
good.
nothing. People carry
Yeah.
these around and, goldback wallets, they'll spend them, they'll give them as tips to, waiters, they'll spend them at garage sales and farmers markets and small businesses and when they shop local and whatever. A lot of use cases for these guys.
Yeah.
Um, if you go, if you went and you looked at that same calculator in 2024, the following year, we had about almost 120,000 uses in a single year.
Wow. That's awesome.
So it just about doubled in just a single year. So we're seeing this adoption where more and more people are not only getting into goldbacks, but we know the goldbacks are circulating. We
Which I
know.
think is powerful. I love this. I think this is a great idea. Like great. Well, I'm skeptical by nature. That's just I don't know. I guess that's just who I am. So like I think I agree that the Federal Reserve is a monopoly. What can we do against it? Because for a long time and even I didn't know like what to do against the Federal Reserve. I just know that I didn't like them. So this gives us a really good option to not have to necessarily, I mean, be all in the Federal Reserve. Why not do something different?
Now, the Federal Reserve, I mean, they would probably argue if we had one of the, Federal Reserve branch bankers here, they'd say, hey, under the Federal Reserve, prosperity has been just unlimited in America, and we enjoy all these things that didn't exist before the Federal Reserve, and we were able to accumulate all this wealth in the country. I mean, I'm not, you know, I I think that there's a lot of shades of gray,
Of
um,
course.
and I'm not going to pretend that I know, all the answers to all the problems, and you know, but I think that looking at the gold back as something that you can participate in. I mean, you don't have to suffer from inflation. You don't have to be part of a system if you don't want to be, and you can do your own thing. And again, it is legal under state law. So it is I guess, a series of local currencies. And, people are using gold backs outside of those 6 states because they're trading with it because it's gold. And we see that while there's more activity in those 6 states, gold backs are being circulated all over the world.
Well, and why
And
wouldn't
now,
they? Just because
well,
it's not in your state doesn't mean that you doesn't mean you can't use it.
right. So we've got, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold backs out there now. It's really early. Um, I think a lot of the designs today that are being made for gold backs will end up being highly collectible later, just because, when we hit $10 billion worth of gold backs, only 2% of those gold backs will be ones that have been printed up until now.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's kind of a reward for early adopters. It's like, yeah, it went from $10 or $2 to $6. Um, but also, if you were, buying gold backs in 2019, those ones are rare enough now where they cost 8 times more than the ones that are being made today. So
Wow.
we're
That's
already
awesome.
seeing a collector's market develop around the gold back as well.
So you said that they're basically counterfeit proof. How is that? How, I guess, is the question.
So they're made through sputtering technology, but you got like 6 different anti-counterfeiting features in the front. On the backs, you've got, designs that are done in UV ink. You can read the serial number as a negative image through it.
Okay.
It's the most high-tech form of bullion you're ever going to see. Um, so there's something really special about that. Um,
Because
you know,
everyone has gotten a counterfeit bill at some point. I mean,
yeah,
I got
yeah,
one out of the self checkout, like as cash back from the self checkout one time. I was like, this is not a $5 bill. Like, this is something else.
yeah. Being able to solve the counterfeiting issue and stay ahead of the counterfeiters is a value proposition in all of itself. If we didn't even have gold in the gold backs and all we did was make a currency with a network that wasn't counterfeitable, it would have some appeal.
Yeah,
You know,
for sure.
be something real to that because that's basically what Bitcoin is,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? Hey, here's a currency that's finite and can't be counterfeited. Gold backs are finite because gold is finite. So here you have a finite, uncounterfeitable currency that behaves like cash. And that hasn't really been a great category before it. And even people that love gold and silver, and I love gold and silver, I would never barter with silver now because our markets are just getting flooded with fakes. There's a lot of fake silver in the market.
I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Yeah. Well, and it's just, it's a reason to, be really careful.
So, where can people find these gold backs?
So I can actually give everybody that watches your show a free gold back if
That's
you go
awesome.
to freegoldback.com.
Okay.
You get a free gold back.
I will also link that in the show notes. That way people can just click on it, make it easy.
Right. Freegoldback.com. And then if you want to learn more about Goldback, we just launched a new website at goldback.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I feel like I learned a lot, like having
Yeah.
you on and talking about the banking system. I just didn't know that much before this, so I really appreciate it.
Well, and I'm still researching it. I apologize if I got anything wrong. Someone's going to be in the comments. They're going to say, "Oh, that's not, the order that happened." It's a really fascinating history. There's some really fascinating history with it, and I'm still researching it and trying to wrap my head around it. But it's
Especially there's so much all the time. And
a lot
you
there.
find one thing and then you find like 10 more things behind it. So you can never know everything.
Right. No, and I apologize if I regurgitated something that wasn't accurate or I misremembered something. I'm doing my best.
I appreciate it.
Well, hey, I
Uh,
appreciate you having me on your show.
of course, of course. Come back anytime. Until next week, my friends, stay skeptical and we will see you all then. Hey friends, The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Danny Mercy. I appreciate all of your support. Please rate and review wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's at rabbit.holepodcast. And thank you, Zakar Balaha, for our awesome intro.